think that's it. Cool. So this is the small team that I joined when I came to Pinterest. To put it into perspective, we have about 1,300 people now. And when I started, we had 0 bytes of data. Now we have hundreds of petabytes of data. And so I've seen a lot. It's been a really crazy experience. When I first joined, I was 2 years out of school, and I was tasked with creating the data strategy for a company that was going to have, multi-billion-dollar market cap. So it was very intimidating. I had no idea what I was doing. And the reason I do this talk is because I think there's a lot of lessons I learned and things I would have done differently if I had more perspective on the problems that we were solving. And I've structured this talk into themes of problems that you're going to run into, regardless of what kind of business you're in. And so I kind of broke it down into yearly, what are the themes of problems we solved, so that as you guys are going through the same types of challenges, if you bucket these into these themes, hopefully you can focus a little bit more than I did initially. So the talk will focus on the progression of analytical needs at an organization. There's a lot of other aspects we could talk about, like data engineering and the applications of data in the product. But this is going to be mostly about the progression of these analytical needs that an organization will have at various stages. So I'm going to be using a lot of examples that are from the Pinterest product to kind of talk about the evolution of these themes. So I figured it'd be good to just jump in and figure out what is Pinterest if you haven't used it. So Pinterest is a tool that the founder made in order for people to be able to collect things online. He was the big bug collector when he was a kid, and so his idea was, can I bring that online so someone can take some image they have of a bug, save it onto a board, and then have many boards for the different kinds of interests that they have. So every day, today, millions of people come to Pinterest to do things like decide, what am I going to wear, or what am I going to eat? What's my workout regimen going to be this month to achieve the goals that I have? I personally got into Pinterest and heard about it way before my friends because my wife was in school and she was busy with school while we were planning our wedding. So I planned our whole wedding on Pinterest. So this user that I just showed here, Michael, he's the real user we did some qualitative research on. He used Pinterest to plan rebuilding his whole house. He had built his first house and it was a fixer-upper. And so if this user comes to Pinterest, he'll find hundreds of pins in a single session, and he might find one that catches his eye, like this one right here. It's a rustic chandelier for the kitchen. As soon as he takes that pin and he saves it, it becomes a part of a massive corpus of pins. And there are billions of pins on Pinterest, but the thing that's really interesting about Pinterest is that concept of boards. All of a sudden, these billions of pins kind of organize around similar concepts. And if you look at his pins in his rustic kitchen, you'll see that it'll overlap with some other board called chandeliers, another board called DIY lighting, and this becomes a very, very powerful data set where if you take a step back, you can start to see themes. And so this idea here is what we describe as the taste graph. Much like a social graph like Facebook, where you can look at degrees of separation to say these two people probably know each other, they probably have some similar aspects of their previous education or where they live. The taste graph takes these billions of ideas that people have and orients them in a way where you can see that these two things are kind of similar, they're this many degrees away from a taste perspective, and that actually becomes a very, very powerful foundation for a discovery engine. It's unlike any data set I've ever seen in my life, and it's actually unlocked some features that are very unique to Pinterest. So one of my favorite examples is if you actually go to that pin on Pinterest right now, you can scroll down and you'll see all these related pins. And you can see that these pins aren't exactly the same thing. Some of them are chandeliers, some of them aren't. But what you'll see is that they have a very similar aesthetic to them or similar taste to them. You can see why the person who originally pinned the other one would be interested in these. And you can't always put it in terms of a search query. So that's where Pinterest becomes very, very useful for discovery. Now, to get a sense of scale, Pinterest is a big system. We have over 1 billion of these boards, well over 100 billion pins saved across these boards. And every month, we have about 2 billion searches being issued against our search backend, and the taste graph powers all of these search responses. And in addition to search, we do a ton of recommendations across home feed and across related pins. So we have on the order of 2 trillion, and I think this number is actually growing quite a bit, recommendations we make. That's 2 trillion times a year that some part of the system goes that I should show this pin to this user because of X, Y, and Z that they've done in the past or that I know about them. So, like I was saying, this adventure into Pinterest for me was very, very intimidating initially. I had hundreds of decisions to make, from what data infrastructure do we use, all the way up to what are the key metrics that the CEO is going to be reporting to the board. And I didn't know exactly where to start when we first sat down. I put together a bunch of documentation, and our CEO kind of told me, hey, Mo, let's take a step back, and let's decide what is our top line goal with bringing data to Pinterest. And we sat and we talked through a few ideas, and we said, what if we settled on this goal? Every decision at Pinterest should start with data and end with data. We use data to inform what we're going to do, and when we do those things, we go back and we make sure that we actually achieve the goals that we set out initially. And so this became a guiding principle throughout the history of Pinterest as we built a very data-driven organization. So when I interviewed at Pinterest, it was 2011. Like I said, there was no data there. But one thing that I really want to call out is it's never too early to be analytical. Even before we had data, our CEO was making a lot of important decisions that shaped much of Pinterest's future. This is what I call the qualitative stage. One of the biggest insights was he'd go out and talk to users well outside of Silicon Valley, where we are, who were using his product, to figure out, what is it you like about my product? And like I said, originally the idea of the product was very much about utility and developing a tool for yourself to collect things. But one of the users astutely said, Pinterest is like getting a window into another person's point of view. Basically, people cared a lot about someone else who pinned the same thing as me. How do they view this object based off of what else is on the board, and what other boards does that user have? And so that became a foundational part of our mission, this whole idea of discovery. What is discovery? Finding something unexpected for the first time. Pinterest became a place where you go to look at other people's board more than your own in some ways, and it allows you to expand the interests that you have. So, like I said, this was very fundamental. I don't think Pinterest would have ever hired a data person if they didn't get this part right. So even before you have data, you should be analytical. So 2012 is when we became Quantitative. This is where I came in, and I had to build data infrastructure and all these other capabilities. For all of you who raised your hands when I asked if you're an engineer, this is the quick summary of the stack that we ended up using. We had to decide, what do we use to log data as it comes in and not lose it on its way into our persistent store. So Kafka became a big solution for us. Instrumentation, what do our schemas look like? What do we use to persist the data? Thrift kind of is the winner in that space. I'm sure most of you have used Thrift in some capacity. Batch processing, same thing. Hadoop is the clear winner there, but you have to choose your flavor of it and decide whether or not you go with packaged software or use it as a service. And then creating an ETL pipeline. How do you actually schedule all these jobs and create dependencies between them? We actually created a system called Pinball internally, which we've open sourced. And finally, reporting is a big aspect too. People use things like Chartio and Tableau. We started off with some of those systems and eventually built our own system based off of HBase for the storage and React for the front end. All right, I swear that's the end of the data infrastructure conversation. So now that we have this quantitative capability and we built all this infrastructure, how did we use it? The first and most obvious place is to just start counting everything. How many times is X happening? How many people are performing X over a day, over a week, over a month? I spent a lot of time the first month I was there just counting things. And this was one of the very first decisions that we made that was pretty data informed. We saw this trend of desktop versus mobile usage. If you look at this, you can see that mobile is starting to pick up in June of 2012, and desktop looks like it's also picking up. But as we started to project this out, we realized that this is the direction that things were going. And so what we did is in the summer of 2012, we invested very heavily in mobile. We knew that mobile was going to start to take over, and we accelerated that growth. And if we hadn't, Pinterest business would be that green line. And so we made a big push for Android, iOS, both on mobile and on iPad. So that was one of our first data-driven wins. But we wanted to be able to do more than just forecast things and make decisions. We wanted to be able to change the product and see how different changes result in outcomes for the business. So one of the first tests I would say we ran was this. We had opened up Pinterest to be able to sign up on email. Originally, you could only sign up if you had a Facebook or Twitter account. Opening up email introduced all sorts of problems, including spam. And when we first started the email signups, we obviously had a lot of people who didn't have Facebook or Twitter or weren't willing to use it sign up, but we also had a bunch of fake accounts coming in. So we had a machine learning engineer come in and say, okay, I'm going to try to detect all the spam accounts, and at the least we'll silence them so that they can't fill up our public feeds with garbage content. And he did something that basically, let's just say, found X% of signups were spam. I don't want to say the actual number. And I wasn't convinced. I thought it was about 5 times X. So what we did was we scheduled a set of deploys where we hid that sign-up form, but not to machines, just to humans. So they were actually there, so any script that a spammer was using to sign up would continue working, but no real human could possibly click on that and sign up for it. So what happened was we had this very authentic output. For about, I think, an hour or so, that green line was the number of signups we were getting through email, and you can see it just drop suddenly and stay at this level, which I labeled as spam 16.5. That was the units. And you could see that there was an increase in Facebook signups and a slight increase in Twitter signups, the blue line, and then everything went back to normal when we turned this thing back on. So this was a collaboration across teams and a very manual effort, but it was basically a test. And it was very awesome because that green line at 16.5 was a perfect data set for true positives of spam. So we plugged that data back into the same machine learning model, and sure enough, we had about 5x spammers being detected and stopped on our platform. So this is not a scalable approach. I don't recommend you do this for every single test you want to run. What you need to do is create an experimentation platform to be able to test things out. So in 2013, we invested super heavily in creating an experimentation platform for our developers. The experimentation platform looks something like this. We show hundreds of metrics with a bunch of dimensions you can segment on. And so this experiment you see right here is a very positive experiment. Each of those numbers that's blue represents a positive percentage change in the given metric. So if you look at the very first box on the top left, that's saying there's a 7% increase in users who are repinning on the very first day they were exposed to the experiment. And the one on the right is about 27 days in. That positive gain is about 5%. So a lot of information here. We try not to summarize too many things so that you have a good idea of novelty effects that could occur over time, and that you can basically see all the different metrics if there's trade-offs. So this platform gets used a ton. We ran 3,000 experiments last year, and some of the biggest decisions we made on the product, we used this experiment platform to decide on. A very concrete one was this experiment here, where we were using the word pinning to describe saving a pin. It was a very important thing to our brand. But as we went international, we saw that didn't really translate super well in the different countries. And we thought that we would be taking something away from the brand if we removed this notion of pinning. So we ran a series of experiments in a bunch of different countries where we changed the word pinning, and we saw huge gains because users didn't have to understand this abstract concept that didn't translate well to other languages. And actually, this helped a ton with international growth. This is one of those things where I think the qualitative studies would have said, hey, the brand is important, we should keep that consistent across countries. But ultimately, the data spoke, and we made this change across the board, including going back in the States as well and changing it to saving. Now, experimentation is funny because when you set it up, it's always statistical. There's always a probability that the experiment might be a little bit off. And so this is an experiment here where those red boxes are not quite zero. They're about 0.3% down. But this experiment, a lot of people will look at it and say, that's probably just noise. Let's go ahead and launch it. To give some context, this experiment here was when we added progressive loading of images on the iPhone. So if you're familiar with progressive loading, what it does is it downloads the image in a way that you can start to show a lower resolution version of it so that the perceived latency goes down. And people have done this across the board. Every study shows that it increases engagement. And for us, it didn't, but it kind of looked neutral. And the engineers just wanted to get it out. They came to me and said, hey, Mohammad, can we launch this thing? The dashboard doesn't look positive. And I pushed back and I said, no, let's look into this. And they were starting to get a little frustrated. They ran the experiment a couple times just in case there was some random chance that the distributions were wrong when we first triggered the experiment. They did a bunch of different things and actually proved hey, look, this thing actually works on this device. There's really no edge cases. And eventually, we finally figured out what the problem was. It turned out that for some small fraction of users that had older devices with limited memory, the progressive loading actually had a bigger memory footprint on the phones, and those phones would actually crash. So even though the bandwidth and downloading didn't change, these phones were crashing. And this was actually a really, really important insight for us that informed a lot of other decisions we made later on. Not only that we should listen to our dashboards, but that if you treat your user base as one homogeneous group, your user base will become one homogeneous group. If you optimize the experience for your own experience as a user with a high-end iPhone, you're going to scare away all the users who have lower-end iPhones. And those users are usually not early evangelists that are using your product, so in your experiments, they won't actually represent a big enough part of the population for you to realize the hidden cost. So in 2014, I would say the big lesson we learned is take all of the experimental stuff we're doing, as well as the other metrics, the quantitative metrics we had, and add in the segmentation, where you can slice it by what country the user is in, what kind of device they have, how long they've been on your platform, gender, user behavior, and all of these different dimensions. And this was no small feat. For anybody who's a data engineer, you know that taking a metric like repins, it might be one row a day to capture how many repins you had. But if you want to know it for each country, that's 120 rows at least. And if you want to know by gender, that's 240 rows. And it starts to multiply out, where the data that you're trying to serve in your dashboards goes from being a couple megabytes a day to potentially gigabytes or terabytes. So this was actually a big effort across data engineering as well as data science and analytics. Cool. So the next big thing that was, this is an example of us using segmentation. If you ran an experiment that optimized for the search result football, this would win every day when your user base is mostly in America. But for folks in Europe, which is a growing population, the results on the right are better. And so it becomes super important to run one experiment and not just look at what the average engagement was, the lift or decrease, but to say in America it went up by 10%, in these other countries it went down by 80%. The net was that it was flat, but we know that that was a really bad experience in the people in the other countries. And that's a growing population, so we need to listen. And so that led to more personalization in our algorithms, And we continue to look at all of our algorithms changes across different countries. Another big thing was as we were running more and more experiments, what we would often do is optimize for engagement. Did you click on a pin? Did you repin a pin? Did you go from the pin to the original website it came from? And you can imagine somebody coming and searching for this query, bead pixel art, somebody who wants to actually make these things with beads. And they're scrolling like crazy and not clicking on anything, right? You know, if this was Google and you were searching for something and you scrolled super deep, that's usually a sign that that query wasn't great, right? If it's not in the first page, it's probably a bad result. But that's not the case here. And one of the dangers you run of just listening to metrics of did the user click on this or that is that, again, you're starting to optimize for certain use cases, such as maybe recipes, and there's an entire user base of passionate users who are having a great experience with this, who you're going to basically potentially replace with clickbait. And so there's a concept called Goodhart's Law, which says as soon as you take a measure of good, like clicking or repinning, and you turn that thing into a target, what's going to happen is your system and the behavior of the people who are developing your system is going to change in a way where that measure may no longer be a good measure because people start to optimize for it. And clickbait, as you've seen on other platforms, is a perfect example of that. People are just optimizing towards getting clicks, and a lot of times what that means is people are putting spammy stuff on there, people are making you click on things that could have clearly just been explained in the document on Pinterest or whatever platform you were on. And so it's important to start to take a step back and say, what are we really trying to measure, and are we measuring that or not? So we did just that in 2015. What we introduced is this notion of human evaluation. The idea with human evaluation is, rather than figure out, is pixel bead art returning good results because the user clicked on the first pin that came up, you ask the question directly from human beings. You say, is this a relevant result for the given query? And this is an expensive thing to do. You use crowdsourcing to do it. You have to do a bunch of data science to say whether or not you trust the people who are inherently subjective compared to machines. But it turns out that it's worth it, and a lot of very big companies do use this methodology. And so we created an entire human evaluation platform. This is the first version of it that I actually prototyped myself. The idea here is you get a search query like exterior house paint red brick. Very verbose query. And on the left side, it's one algorithm's results. On the right side, it's another algorithm's results. And you ask a human being to tell you which one is more relevant. And you have probably 10 people answer this same question. And you do it for 100 different queries just to get a representative sample. And you complement all the decisions you're making with your online metrics with these metrics to make sure you're optimizing for the right things. Cool. So another example that I want to talk about is this video distribution experiment we ran. Video is clearly a super important thing on the web these days. You've seen more and more of social networks and even media companies in general put video online. And for Pinterest, we had to bootstrap video. Because the taste graph was full of content that's static and was not videos, we basically had to go in and say, okay, let's bring a bunch of video content onto Pinterest and increase the likelihood that it gets seen by our users. So basically, we had to promote it to solve what's called a cold start problem. So this experiment here, you can see that at some point in early July of 2016, we suddenly ramped up the chances of video being seen, where you can see that it went from 2 million impressions to 6 million impressions. And you can see that over time, there's a steady increase. This is not the actual data, but just imagine that this is what we were seeing on our side for the sake of simplicity. If you looked at that experiment, the results were really interesting, because you can see that the people in the control group, the people who were not getting this boost, and the people in the treatment group prior to the experiment starting had the same chance of seeing videos. When we ran the experiment, what you thought would happen did happen. The people who were actually getting this promotion of videos saw way more videos. But you also see the red line, which is the control group, start to gradually see more videos and catch up to the population we were promoting videos on. And this is a very weird thing, right? Because you didn't change anything for the control group. This idea is called leakage. When you run controlled A/B experimentation, you don't expect the control group to affect the treatment group. This is a really nuanced concept. It takes some time to grasp. You really have to run a lot of experiments to understand this nuance. But it's actually a very, very dangerous thing, because you might run this experiment, and that dashboard that I showed you would show a 250% increase on the top left. But as you start going towards the right, it says that this thing is only marginally better, and you may decide that we're not going to launch this experiment. But what's really happening is, as I get more videos being in the test group, I am saving more videos, and my followers are more likely to see those videos. And so over time, the actual measure of difference between the two groups is no longer valid. This is a really big problem that big social networks have to run into, and stop relying just on the first order output of their experiments and really think about viral loops and network effects. So, we're 4 years into our analytical capabilities, and we start to hit the limits of standard experimentation. And so we have to start to create network-aware analysis. And this is nothing new. Actually, a lot of businesses run into this with marketing from day one. They want to know, if they advertise, what effect does it have on their business? And they can't really run a proper experiment. So this is something that we only did recently at Pinterest, is we started putting, in emerging countries like London, we started actually having Pinterest advertised in certain cities. And one of the strategies to get around these network effects is we can't ask half the people to walk in to not look at the banners and test which half actually was more likely to engage. So what we end up doing is we do what's called Doppelganger Analysis, where we say, okay, these two cities have very similar trends. This is one that we actually ran in this marketing campaign in. How do the two diverge? And it's not quite as scientific, but it's absolutely necessary, and it's about as good as it gets. Cool. So, we're still working on all of this. There's still more work to be done. I still don't know what I'm going to look back and say we did and learned in 2017. But I think one thing that's starting to emerge is, as we're scaling, as we're having hundreds of people running simultaneous experiments, one of the things that becomes extremely challenging is, how do we make sure that these hundreds of people are making decisions consistently? Back in the day when we ran a few experiments, I could be involved in every decision and make sure that the work that's being done here and the work that's being done here is converging towards a better Pinterest. But nowadays, you might find one team optimizing for metric X at the cost of metric Y, another team doing the exact opposite. And it's actually a very, very challenging thing if you think about it. It's not to say that one is right or the other and the other is wrong. It's just that things start to become really, really nuanced, and sometimes it may be the right strategy to do one versus the other, but it doesn't make sense to do both of them. You need to be consistent, and you need to make sure that the sum of the parts is at least equal to the whole. And so one of the really big things we've been working on is creating these distributed decision-making models. That means investing in much more robust analytical frameworks for how you make trade-offs between different metrics. Another big thing is process and documentation. Making sure that even if not every person is at the table when these decisions are being made, that the documentation is laid out in a consistent format, that different people can actually access it and make informed decisions. There's a bunch of other things we're working on as well right now. So just to give you an example, this feature here is called Pinterest Lens. It allows you to snap a photo of something in the real world and tap into the taste graph. So it's a very powerful concept, right? We talked about how the taste graph allows you to find things that are related, but how do you bring the real world into that? Lens is trying to achieve that. So you can see how The product is starting to get complex. We're starting to try a lot of different things. And we need to make sure that people are working together towards the same goal, even if they're not always working on the same set of projects. And so this project may have slightly different first-order goals, but we make sure that it actually ties in to the same mission that we have at a high level. Another area where we're investing heavily in is knowledge. So we have an entire team dedicated to creating this taste graph as a real concept. So initially it was kind of this abstract thing I was talking about, but really we're trying to turn it into a platform where anybody can plug in and build the next feature that's leveraging the full potential of the taste graph. So early on we talked a little bit about this goal we set out initially. And I think we did a pretty good job at Pinterest. Creating the experimental framework allows us to come back and make sure that whatever data-informed project we had in mind, we came back and verified it. Having a decision-making framework like launch reviews makes sure that we're not just saying we're data-informed, but having inconsistent parameters for how we decide what gets launched. But one of the things I want to call out is at every stage of the evolution of our analytical framework, I didn't exactly know what we're going to do next. I had to trust my gut, but I think the thing that really helped me, and I think that this is something that each of you hopefully takes away from this talk, is that the decisions that I made at every stage about where we invest didn't just come from wanting to use data. It came from wanting to wow our users, right? Every decision should start with our users and end with our users. If I was just geeking out on, we should be using Spark with a little bit of Kafka, with a little bit of this and that, I don't know where we would have ended up. And unfortunately, too often I go to these talks and I hear people just talking about the latest and greatest technology because that's apparently what new grads think is really important. And it's really unfortunate. I interview a lot of really bright people who come to me and they're just talking about these technologies and they're not really talking about how they're going to apply data. They're not using sound logic to convince me that if they came to Pinterest, they would actually help move the business forward. And so my recommendation to everyone who asks me about how to develop a career in analytics or data science is that you should really chase the problems you have. And so if you're a B2B business, it's not about your users, it's about whatever ecosystem you're in or the businesses that you have. But ultimately, don't look at data science as the science of data. Look at it as the science of whatever business that you're in. And that will force you to make the right decisions, and technology just becomes a tool along the way. So with that, I just want to go back and talk about Michael A. Then we followed up with him, and he did a pretty good job of building his house. But I think he's a reminder of what we do at Pinterest and where we focus our efforts. And that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
Mohammad, thank you so much. So we're going to shimmy over here so we can have a look at some of the questions that have come in for you. I use Pinterest, I have to say. I have a number of boards for a number of different reasons. Okay, so first question. So it's interesting to hear about your wins from data. Do you have any insights from failures?
Do I have any insights from failures? These are insights from, we run thousands of experiments, and maybe at most we run hundreds of them. So I'm trying to think about the canonical example of a failure. I would say one of the really interesting things was that we always wanted to be data-driven, but you always have this pressure to get things launched. And it's really important as a person who wants to be data-driven and wants to force the organization to focus on these things that I call important but not urgent, like building a robust analytics framework. And so a concrete example is we did a complete redesign of our website. It was so much more beautiful and aesthetically pleasing and all of these things, and the designers really pushed this forward. But at the time, it didn't feel like it was actually improving Pinterest, and we didn't have an experimentation framework. And we were this close to launching it, but one of the data scientists on my team went and started pooling all of this data together that basically showed that we were losing a lot of metrics. So basically she was like creating experimental data without us having an experimentation framework by comparing different cohorts that had similar behavior before and after we launched this product. And that basically delayed that product being launched for about 2 months, but it forced the entire company to be waiting and pushing for us to build the experimentation framework so that we can actually launch that product correctly. And it was clear as day. I mean, there were like 3 or 4 features that in the redesign they hadn't prioritized because they were like, oh, that's not an important feature. And it turned out that those things were driving so much engagement. So I would say that that's the biggest insight I have about failure, is that it's a good opportunity to actually force wins on the data infrastructure and data capability side.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, so what is the weirdest and most surprising result of a test that you've received?
All right. So I would say that the example I gave about the progressive loading not leading to more engagement was really surprising. But once we figured it out, it was like, of course, like we're crashing some people's application. But there are a lot of other things that were really interesting in the same vein. So one example was we had done all of this work to remember which part of the application you were in, so that when you backgrounded the app, even if the state of the app was lost, we'd reload back to the page that you were at. Somebody broke that feature. And there was something very similar too, where we removed the chances of you seeing the same pin multiple times. Both of these experiments led to huge lifts in engagement. And you were like, what? Like, why did we build this thing all along and it was actually holding our metrics back? It turned out that taking people back to the page they were looking at 2 days ago is not as useful as just showing them their home feed. And the same thing about duplicate pins. When you remove duplicate pins too aggressively, you're actually removing pins that were really, really popular and they were likely to be super engaging. The reason they're duplicates is that to begin with, they were really popular pins. So these things are super counterintuitive and actually informed. We didn't just stop and say, okay, well, we're going to leave that bug in there. We actually took those things and turned them into real ideas for new projects.
Right, okay. Right, so which matrix do you use to measure the quality of content and community?
That is a great question. So quality is really, really tough. When you talk about quality, if I just base quality based off of likelihood of somebody clicking on a pin, I would end up with a bunch of fake free Starbucks vouchers on Pinterest. I mean, people really try to game the system. And so what we do for quality of content is that we take a look at a mix of metrics, like what is the ratio between repinning, clicking, and viewing a pin? What is the normal range for content that makes sense? And we also segment it on different categories. So for different categories, this number might be appropriate, that it has a high click-through or lower click-through. Like the pixel art doesn't have super high click-through, and that's totally okay. From a community perspective, we really try to focus on understanding whether or not we have enough critical mass. So what we do is we say, okay, look, if we're going to go and target the wedding scene in Hungary, let's actually count how many people are in that scene and how big that population is, and figure out what number we need to achieve for there to be enough flow of data that it actually we can have a community, versus just taking a community that already has a lot of pins or a lot of users and adding incremental ones that don't really add incremental value. So it's really about understanding marketplaces that we want to target and figuring out what is the threshold we want to meet, both on the user side as well as the content side, in order to have a lively community.
Okay, great. So how do you envision Pinterest managing data during future years?
How do I envision them managing data in future years? So I think at Pinterest, we have a lot of work to do with data. I mean, we have to basically always make sure we're up to regulations, especially in Europe. You guys are a lot more privacy-centric. So as we're trying to become more and more of an international business, there's a lot of work we need to do to anonymize data, make it possible for data to be deleted and removed when a user requests it, make sure there isn't a bunch of phantom information left over in aggregated and derived data sets. So there's a lot of work and effort around the data itself there. In terms of how I envision us being data-driven, I think it really is about creating much better frameworks where people can work independently and not accidentally screw up, not accidentally cannibalize another business unit with their metrics. And so it's about making those dashboards I showed you a lot simpler, a lot more dummy-proof, making them smart so that if there's 1,000 things we could show you, we actually surface the ones that we think are most important versus just having a static list. And then it's also about creating hierarchy and structure where a team like the data science team, we start to have people operating at higher levels where they're looking across multiple teams and doing higher level analysis versus just being super deep in individual areas where we lose sight of the big picture.
Okay, great. So for our final question, last question is this: how do you keep learning stroke up to date? Any sources that you would recommend?
Keep learning up to date. What do you think that refers to?
So I think it's about this is a question that kind of come up quite a lot over this conference. I think people are really eager to know what our speakers are doing to keep on top of the curve and what they're doing personally around what are they reading, what are they watching, what are they engaging with. So that's the question to you. What are you reading, what are you watching, what are you engaging with to increase your knowledge and keep ahead of the curve?
This is interesting because I have a really strong bias that if you just focus on your own problems, you're going to be much better off than trying to figure out what other people are doing. I think there's always a temptation to be worried about what you're not doing. But I think, first of all, I would just start off and say, are you listening to the people on the ground and the problems that you have at your company? Very few companies that can say they trust all of their core metrics on a daily basis and they'll come out on time every single day and that they can run experiments against those metrics. And so I think if you get those fundamentals down right, you're going to be in a good place. It's rare to actually see companies be in that state consistently. In terms of what to read to keep up, I think something like Hacker News is a great place to just see what are the themes that are emerging over time. But again, I wouldn't get super deep and feel like, oh my God, I'm not using any deep learning, am I missing out? I think you got to look for user problems. Once you identify what user problem you're trying to unlock, then the stuff you're reading outside becomes more and more relevant. I think going to these conferences is great. I think networking is great. But I would say that there's a lot more value in you going and talking to somebody at another company for 5 minutes about a problem that you hit and how they would approach it than if you watched a 10-lecture series on some technology that's not catered to your needs. So certainly networking, leveraging the people here, and following up with them with the problems that you have is going to be much, much more effective than reading white papers or whatever else.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Let's give them a little clap. All right, so we do have a gift for you. This is, I'm not sure if this, it kind of does, but it kind of doesn't look like you.
That's amazing.
But there you are. That is for you to take home and put on your wall.
Cool, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Mohammad. Thank you. Okay.